But the United States didn't accept that. And so nowadays, instead of having just the CIA going around behind the scenes and trying to manipulate the process secretly by inserting money here and instructions there and so forth, they have now a sidekick, which is this National Endowment for Democracy, NED.
Yeah.
And this organization dates from 1967. A lot of people don't realize, because it was just established in, I think, 83 or so, but the idea emerged from a series of scandalous revelations in 1967, the worst ones to that point, to hit the CIA. And I was in headquarters at the time that these scandals broke, and the gloom there was something you could touch almost. Because what happened was the long-running CIA's control and manipulation of the international program of the National Students Association in this country, which was the national organization of university students, came out. It was revealed. And that led to revelations of a lot of other CIA operations, because they were using the same bogus and real foundations to channel money into all these different overseas organizations. And I remember very well that Time magazine at the time, or Newsweek, I think it was Time, they published a wheel with all these spokes going out, and the CIA was at the center, and then halfway out were all these foundations, American organizations, and then out at the end were the foreign groups that got the money and the instructions. Naturally, they don't give away money without being sure that it's spent the way they want it spent. And so this was a catastrophe for the CIA. And the next month or the month after that, this started in February of '67, and then by April, I think it was, Dante Fachel, the congressman from Florida, was proposing the establishment of an open system to finance these overseas organizations. And we're talking about some government organizations abroad, some political parties, some media organizations, youth organizations and student organizations, all these kinds of so-called pluralist organizations, when in fact they weren't really free organizations, because to the degree that they take money and instructions from the CIA, to that degree they're not free at all, right? But anyway, Fachel came up with this idea, but it didn't go anywhere, because the so-called consensus between the two parties had broken down over Vietnam. And so it wasn't until the early '80s, when Reagan made his speech in the House of Commons about the democracy project worldwide, that this began to take on steam again. And finally, they decided to copy the German example. Each of the major German political parties has a foundation which is financed by the German government. Before it was West Germany, now the whole country. And for example, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is the SPD, or the Social Democratic Party's foundation. And they finance projects all over the place, and for years in the 50s and 60s, and I would guess even into the 70s. In fact, I know into the 70s and even to the early 80s, the CIA was channeling money through these German foundations abroad. For example, some money, a lot of money, I think it was $1 million or more, but I'm a little hazy on the amount. But anyway, it went through it was CIA money which went through the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. That's the Christian Democratic Union. It went from there to IVEPO, which is a foundation of the COPE, the Christian Democrats in Venezuela.
Oh.
And from there, it went to the Christian Democrats in El Salvador, to Duarte, for use in the elections. I've forgotten which year, maybe '84 or something like that. And it was traced. Some journalists did this. And so that is the way they would use these German foundations in the past. So now we've got our own. We don't have to use the Germans unless we really want to anymore. Because in 1984, we established this National Endowment for Democracy, which is nothing but a mega conduit. And the millions or the tens of millions that are set aside for the meddling in the internal affairs of other countries goes to this conduit. It's like a bank account or something, but they have a board of directors and they do reports and stuff like that. But then it goes from there to one of four private foundations. One of the Democratic Party, one the Republican Party, or two, three the AFL-CIO, and four the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. These groups then pass it out to recipients in foreign countries. And in the Nicaraguan elections of 1990, I believe the figure was something like 12.5 million that went from the National Endowment for Democracy through these conduits to the UNO political movement there. It was the party, the coalition, you know, of UNO, which is the most ungodly coalition you can ever imagine.
Everything from communists all the way
That's
to
right.
Somocistas.
That's right. And then they had a trade union front, which also received money. And then they had the civic association. Civic association, I think they call it Via Civica there. That's an old technique of the CIA, is to establish a type of civic organization which will be involved in monitoring elections and things like that. And the first one that I know of was NAMFREL in the Philippines. They established that one around 1950-51 as part of the counterinsurgency against the Huks, the guerrilla movement of the time, because we wanted to have a vehicle for electing our man president of the Philippines. And we did it through this organization, NAMFREL. NAMFREL stands for National Association for Free Elections, I think.
Free.
And, yeah, free elections, when we were financing the whole thing. And NAMFREL was very successful. And our man, Ramon Magsaysay, was elected president, I think it was 52, 53. And unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash, 57. And so then we switched to Marcos and various other people like that. But NAMFREL never faded away. And in 1986, remember the elections of 1986, which Marcos tried to steal? Well, NAMFREL was alive and well, and they were the ones who denounced the fraud by Marcos. And they then inspired the movement of People Power, which forced him to resign and brought Cory Aquino in as president. So NAMFREL was alive and well. They tried to copy it in Panama. They sent the president of the Chamber of Commerce in the early 80s, or 84 or there, more or less, in preparation for the 87 elections, I think it was. They sent him out to Panama to study the way NAMFREL worked, so he could come back to Panama and establish another one there. And so he did. In Panama, it was called Cruzada Cívica, or Civic Crusade. And this was what was used against the Noriega forces in the streets. It became what they call Rabi Blanca there. You know, the upper-class white people in Panama. It was one of those organizations. But they did take to the streets, and you can remember the pictures on the covers of the magazines, you know, when they had the riots, and Noriega was not overthrown then. But they tried everything in Panama. The CIA was running candidates of its own all through the 1980s, trying to get Noriega out. Maybe not all through the 80s. No, his utility ended about 86, 87.
Because he was working with the CIA.
Yes,
and doing
yes, it was important for the Contra operation in Nicaragua. But by 87, everybody knew that the Contras were not going to do anything. They weren't going anywhere militarily. And Noriega's importance was in allowing Panama to be used for training them and also for resupply. But that was over by 87, and that's when the efforts began to get him aside, leading to the invasion in 89. But they were up to here in Panamanian politics, and I'm sure they are, using these different types of organizations. So the covert action operations go on. And as a matter of fact, not only in Bulgaria did they overturn this government. I didn't even finish that story, but what happened is all this money from National Endowment for Democracy went in, and they fomented student strikes and demonstrations, trade union strikes, massive street protests, and not only was the money put in by the National Endowment for Democracy, but also Paul Weyrich's Free Congress Foundation got involved. And this is part of the Christian right, you know. He's the man who runs all these different organizations out of the same address in Washington, D.C. And this Free Congress Foundation also got going in there, I guess in coordination with what the CIA was doing, what NED was doing, and so forth. And so the elections were in June. The communists had, or the former communists had won. By the end of November, they were out because they made the country ungovernable. 1991, they did the same thing in Albania. They had elections there. Free, fair, no fraud. Former communists won. The United States got in there through these different organizations and the CIA, naturally, and they made Albania ungovernable.
Chile, same thing.
Chile, same thing. Brazil in the early 60s, same thing. We were doing the same thing when I was in Ecuador. In fact, we had two coups, two unconstitutional changes of government when I was there, and they were largely due to what we were doing. And by the time I left, after 3 years, we had what we wanted, a four-man military dictatorship that was carrying on a very strong repression against the left.